Hey all, Alex here. I wanted to make this video very briefly to discuss my thoughts on the current controversy that is going around in the world of music theory, Twitter, YouTube, other adjacent lands. Not because I feel like I have something incredibly new to add to the conversation, but just because this is something that is near and dear to my heart. This community has a lot of personal meaning to me, and I thought it would be useful to kind of uh, process my feelings on what is ultimately a pretty complicated situation. So, for those people who are not aware of what I'm talking about, I'm referring to a situation involving two of the most popular music theory YouTubers. One of them being Adam Neely, who, as of this video, has about 1.75 million subscribers. The other YouTuber is Sideways, who has, as of this video, just under 1 million subscribers. Neely and Sideways both break down music theory concepts in ways that are accessible to the average person, but I find that they do it in different ways. If you've not already checked out their channels, Adam, I think, takes these general theoretical concepts and kind of riffs on them in his videos. He does ones that break down particular subjects, niche ideas, and then kind of riffs on them. Sideways kind of frames his theory discussions around films and musicals and other forms of media like that. There's exceptions to both of these rules, but these things are how they've kind of built their brand identity, if you will. Now, the discourse that I'm referring to kind of started with the H-Bomber Guy video about plagiarism that came out a few days ago. That's been making the rounds on YouTube. It's kind of the point of discussion as other video essayists are kind of chiming in, and it's sort of been a day of reckoning for people who are adjacent to that community. Sideways has been recently making some suggestive tweets about explaining his hiatus from making videos in light of this. If you notice, while Adam still uploads content frequently, Sideways has not uploaded a video in over 2 years. Well, Adam Neely responded to that tweet, and since then it has engaged a sea of discourse, including some of the most well-known names in Twitter's music theory circles like Robert Koniecki and Arvo Fährt as well. Now, this conversation itself is actually a continuation of discussions that have been brought up periodically for at least a couple of years now. And the general gist of it is this: Sideways has accused Adam Neely of plagiarism on at least 2 separate counts. And it is in part because of Adam's response to those accusations, or should I say lack thereof, in Sideways' opinion, that Sideways decided to stop making YouTube videos, period. Now, I do want to give my opinions just briefly on these 2 different accusations. I've kind of looked into both of them, watched the appropriate videos, did some outside digging and things like that, and just give my perspective on what I think is a pretty misunderstood situation by a lot of people. Although I will say I think music theory Twitter, generally speaking, appears to be taking the same frame of mind that I do. So the first of these 2 points is the one that contains arguably the most quote-unquote irrefutable evidence. It is that Adam stole the concept, or part of the concept, and the sources from a 2018 video that Sideways did called The Gateway to Coco's Memories, about the Pixar film Coco and its utilization of music as a memory unlocking technique for a character that's suffering from memory loss. There were controversies about the similarities between Sideways' video and the one that Neely would put out a few months later. Even at the time, Neely initially apologized and linked to Sideways' video in the video description. He then later took down his own video, saying that he, quote, unintentionally copied some of Sideways' video, end quote. Now, the Neely video in question, it came out about 5 months after the one that Sideways did. It was called Why Pop Music Sounds Bad to You. There is a re-upload that you can watch on YouTube to reference the differences between both of those 2 videos. Now, first of all, the general concept does have some overlap in the sense that both Neely and Sideways are talking about neuropsychological interactions with music, how music impacts the developing brain in childhood and in adolescence, and in how music affects the brain in elderly people, people with dementia or memory loss. Having said that, the dementia piece specifically is not something that Neely focuses on for more than a minute of his 8 minute long video. And the film Coco is not mentioned once in there. So already the overlap there, while it certainly exists, is not especially strong. And I think you can really probably get away with calling these related topics. And in that sense specifically, it's not a strike that I would hold against Neely per se. But let's get to the sources because I think that is the meat of what the Sideways argument is. Now, Sideways video lists a total of 10 sources in the video description, all nice and neat, very well assembled. Neely's video uses several different sources that are kind of screenshotted throughout. A grand total of 3 of those sources are utilized in the Sideways video. So 3 out of the 10 that Sideways incorporated in his own video. The first of these is the 2018 New York Times article, The Songs That Bind by Seth Stevens Davidowitz. This is an article meant to describe a New York Times study that was done around that time on how frequently different songs are listened to depending on the listener's age and gender. Now, it's an interesting study. It was a pretty popular study at the time, and multiple other articles make reference to it. In fact, in Neely's video, the screenshot that he uses is of an article that is not the New York Times article. However, given the circumstances, the core source material is the same, so I am not going to be pedantic about it. I am going to count this as the same source. So that's 1. Number 2 is Daniel J. Levitin's famous book, This Is Your Brain on Music. And I think the most egregious part here, allegedly, is Neely quoting an excerpt from the book that Sideways actually quotes in his own video description. Now, that feels, I don't want to call it blatant, but the overlap there is definitely suspicious, and it is probably the most uncomfortably coincidental thing out of this whole discourse. Having said that, This Is Your Brain on Music is one of the most famous books about the relationship between music and the human brain that has ever been written. It is in so many households of people who study music. In fact, I'm looking at my bookcase right next to me. The book literally is sitting on the bookcase right next to me right now. I own a copy of it. This is pretty much everybody's first go-to source on the subject. I would be shocked if a video essay didn't cite it. Now, the overlapping passages, I think, is an interesting coincidence, if it truly is one. Like I said, it's probably the most damning thing about this whole situation, but copying the source itself, it's not altogether unheard of that Neely could have conceived of it entirely independently. Who knows, but either way, it's not something I necessarily hold against him in that side of things. I think the specific quote is where it gets a little bit more iffy. The other source that is used is actually a YouTube video called Man in Nursing Home Reacts to Hearing Music from His Era. This is a YouTube video from 2011 that has over 2 million views, or had over 2 million views when these videos were made. Now, again, when you were considering that they are talking about similar subjects, the fact that they reference this video as an example of memories being stimulated by music shouldn't be too surprising. This is probably the most effective visual example of such a concept that you would have been able to find, and still one of the most effective that you were able to find today. So again, at this point, you're going back to the discussion of, was Adam's choice of subject too similar to Sideways? And I think when you look at the two, I find it hard to agree with that. I think, again, if you were to say that Adam is being too much of a copycat here, then you're really getting into, can you have 2 different prominent video essays done about neuropsychology, about how the brain and music relate, especially as it pertains to aging, without any sort of copyright allegations or plagiarism accusations? And I think that seems like a slippery slope. Again, especially with the direct quote from the Leviton book, while I could understand Neely potentially using some of the same sources, like actively recalling them being used in this video and utilizing them intentionally, I think to call this plagiarism is a major stretch. And I think, at worst, Neely probably should have acknowledged the Sideways video from the get-go, maybe as an alternative framing of some of these same topics. Having said that, again, I think the Neely video is different enough to warrant a view on its own merits. I think the framing is reasonably different. And again, it is still available on YouTube as a re-upload if you want to check it out. Now, the second alleged instance of plagiarism comes from a comment Sideways made in his 2016 video, The Song That Changed My Life, about the famous Franz Schubert song Der Urkönig, where Sideways compares major and minor key signatures to languages, specifically comparing the relationship between two adjacent keys on the circle of fifths to Spanish and Portuguese, both of them being interrelated languages with similar vocabulary and grammatical structures. I am using his words when describing this. 2 years later, Adam Neely filmed a segment for a video essay that Vox published called The Most Feared Song in Jazz Explained, very famous essay about John Coltrane's Giant Steps. In this video, Neely also references the circle of fifths, makes the analogy to musical keys being like languages, and compares two adjoining keys to Spanish and Portuguese. Now, to someone not familiar with how music is taught in an academic setting, or really even in a high school setting, this might seem like questionable overlap. And I say this because easily the most fervent advocate for Sideways has been his partner, Sarah. You can follow her on Twitter to understand her perspective. She has a lengthy thread from back in May that goes over a lot of this, and I will link that in the description. I do think it's important to understand her side of things. Sarah, by her own admission, does not have a musical background. This is not something to be ashamed of, and none of this is me intending to shame Sarah for her opinions or for the act of defending her partner. I think it makes complete sense why she is coming to bat fervently for someone who she believes has been wronged, and I think her lived experience is valid. I am not trying to throw shade. I'm not trying to throw hate. Please do not target her Twitter with any sort of vile attacks if you see this video. And let's state facts here. It is a factual statement that her perspective is not an impartial one, because how could it be? You are dealing with a loved one here. It makes sense. Again, I'm not shaming her for that. And if she did not have the experience learning music in an academic or a school setting where the circle of fifths and modulation and that concept would be taught, then she probably wouldn't have reason to know that the language analogy that Sideways is using here is remarkably common. Now, again, I personally completed an undergraduate degree in music with emphasis in music theory and music history, and I'm not trying to toot my own horn here, but I am vouching for this framing of the concept of modulation, and I'm trying to do so genuinely and honestly. This analogy was mentioned multiple times during my college career. It is the most effective way of describing the relationship between keys because it is an analogy that pretty much anybody can understand. I know there are some people who say that they don't necessarily think it is a great analogy and that they prefer others, but it is one of the most common ones that I have seen. So I think a lot of people use it, and it makes sense that Sideways would have drawn from that when making his video. In particular, Arvo Fert on Twitter referred to it as not just an analogy, but a colloquialism, which from my lived experience is accurate, because this is everyday fare if you are explaining this concept to someone who doesn't really have a frame of reference for how keys relate to one another. Now, let's explore the Spanish and Portuguese angle a little bit. We talk about keys that are closely related frequently in the context of music theory, because keys that are closely related form the foundation for the concept of modulation, when one key transitions into another, oftentimes by exploiting a 5-1 relationship between two different tonal centers. For example, F major and B flat major are right next to each other in this circle of fifths sequence. All the notes in their respective scales overlap except for one. F major, in that scale, there is an E. B flat major has an E flat instead. And if I play an F major chord with an E flat added on top of it to make an F7 chord, the vast majority of the time, the next chord that I play will be B flat major because there is a sense of tension that needs to resolve. That is a very, very high level and generalized example, but just for anyone who doesn't understand what I'm referencing here, now hopefully you more or less understand it a little bit better. So they are very closely related, and we've already established that the language analogy is a common one in music theory circles. Again, ask anyone in the music theory field and they will tell you as much. Now, when you think of two closely related languages, and I will assume that most people watching this video are from the West and perhaps from English-speaking countries. Most of us are probably going to be familiar with Spanish and Portuguese. If we think of similar languages, Spanish and Portuguese will probably be the first two that most of us think of. If you live in Europe, Spain and Portugal are right there for the taking, essentially. If you live in the Americas, most countries in North and South America speak Spanish, and Brazil has the highest amount of Portuguese speakers of any country in the world. The examples are in front of us. It is a logical deduction that most music theorists, when put in the position that Adam was in that Vox video, would come up with. This is not up for debate. Plagiarism, by definition, is the idea of presenting someone else's work or ideas as your own. So, in order to make a conclusive case that Adam Neely did plagiarize his ideas, Sideways would need to prove one of two things. Either he is the first person on record to compare musical keys to languages, which is demonstrably false. There is a paper on Twitter from 2013 that someone posted that refutes it on its own. Otherwise, he would need to prove that while he is not the first person to make that comparison, he is the first to specifically cite Spanish and Portuguese as examples. Which, again, given how easy it would be geographically to draw that conclusion for someone like himself and like Adam, both of whom are from the United States, that seems like a tall task and not something that would hold up in a court of law, certainly, or really under public scrutiny, as I think we are starting to see. And not to cite him as an example when I'm already kind of using this space to defend him, but Adam himself brought up this point on Twitter. When you were talking in front of a camera without prepared notes in front of you, as he was in the Vox video here, it's the height of absurdity to suggest that the same levels of academic scrutiny regarding citations apply to comments that he makes in that setting rather than the prepared, scripted styles of video essays that H-Bomber Guy makes reference to in his video. Especially when the frustration is directed at Adam rather than Vox themselves, who created and edited the video and made the editorial decision to upload that section. I should also say in passing that I have watched the video made earlier this year by, I'm going to pronounce his name, Nate, about Adam Neely and how he is apparently wrong about a lot, according to the video title, which goes over this situation a little bit. I will not acknowledge it beyond that. I think it contains a lot of weak arguments mixed with one or two fair points, all of that being hidden amidst a lot of what is ultimately just kind of chin scratching and, that seems suspicious type of proselytizing. I think it's a waste of time. But yeah, I don't really have much else to say beyond what I've kind of described here. I do think most of the music theory sect of Twitter is supportive of Neely in this whole endeavor, and I do feel sympathy for Sideways. I'm not trying to come at him. I know that he has faced issues with other entities supposedly ripping off his content, and I understand that this affects his income as well as his creative drive. It is not something to sneeze at. That said, I will not allow sympathy to cloud the facts of the case, and the facts are that whatever Neely did wrong in these situations has been grossly overstated, and I think it is a detriment to his image, as well as the reputation of Sideways, frankly, that we are having such a reactionary and short-sighted discussion about what plagiarism looks like in these types of videos. And for as much good as the H-Bomber Guy video may end up doing in the long run for holding video essayists accountable for citation and, God forbid, creating original content, I believe we are already seeing a pivot into accusations of plagiarism when creators make videos that are generally adjacent topic-wise. And that is a detriment to the whole act of YouTube video creation and telling stories, relaying facts, that I think video essayists are trying to achieve. Music theory YouTube is not exactly a huge market segment to begin with, and the ones that are noteworthy are, for the most part, really excellent as far as the analysis that they do and the videos that they produce. So let's maybe not tear each other apart from the inside out. That's all I have. I appreciate you watching this. Go ahead and let me know what you think. If you have opinions on the situation, I would be happy to hear them. Again, not trying to throw anybody under the bus, but I do think it's important to kind of lay out the facts as best we can and have an honest and appropriate discussion about this. So, appreciate you watching. Take care.